trade deficits, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficit, deficit, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade policy, trade deficit, deficit, trade deficits, trade policy, deficit, policy, trade policy, trade deficits, trade policy, trade policy, trade policy, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade policy, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade deficit, trade supply chain, trade deficits, supply chain, trade deficits, trade deficit, trade deficits, supply chain, trade policy, supply chain, trade deficits, trade deficits, trade policy, trade deficits, trade policy, trade policy, trade supply chain, trade policy, trade supply chain, trade deficit, trade policy, trade deficit, trade deficits, policy, trade deficit, trade policy,
Supply policy.